I'm a farmer and I have been concerned about the state of our soils for a very long time. I'm an organic farmer first and foremost, and so feel to some extent over quite a long time that I've been battling against the wind, that a lot of farmers sort of see organic as a threat. So what I find really exciting about Groundswell is it seems to draw lots and lots of different threads of farming together in a non-challenging way, in a collaborative way. So there are organic farmers here, there are people, who are concerned about the soil but still find organic quite challenging. There are people from, ancillary industries, but it just feels like everybody is trying to solve the same problem rather than trying to score points. During the war, we stopped talking to our customers because we weren't allowed to. We became producers of food for a nation at war. It was illegal to sell. Everything was rationed. After the war, the policy was all around production. We must never risk starvation again. So farmers became producers. They became the only industry I know of in the world where they didn't have to think about sales and marketing. And over time, initially, they were looked after by the government, who was encouraging them to follow that line. But eventually they got forgotten, as governments always do, and they had forgotten by then how to sell and market what they're doing and tell the stories of how they produced what they're producing. And so we've ended up with this industry that's been sort of, abandoned really or it's abandoned its customers, and it relies on other people. And those other people, funnily enough, take the profits, because that's what happens in economics. And so we have an industry that has become incredibly good at squeezing its costs, at coming up with new technologies, very, very resilient at operating on very thin margins, but is absolutely hopeless at telling its stories and earning a decent crust for all of that hard work. Well, I think it's a big problem, and I've been talking today about some of the strategies that I am following or I have seen being followed. But I don't think there is a sort of quick fix to any of this. But I think, at a farm level, I would encourage every farmer to start producing something that they can differentiate from everything else and start working out how they can sell it. So, for example, I have a flour mill on our organic farm, and having bought a flour mill, you start thinking much more about what you're putting in through the flour mill, and you start talking to local bakers, and they start asking you for things that perhaps you didn't know they wanted. So it's little things like that, and often I'm spoken to by big farmers who say, well, that's all very interesting, but I've got way too much to do, to process that way. And I have to say, well, you've got to start somewhere. All I can say is if you had a 5-year strategy around just building a small outpost of value-added production on your farm, I bet that your second 5-year strategy would show it growing and would show you putting more energy into it, and it would give you much more pleasure out of what you were doing. So I'm not suggesting that every wheat farmer in Hertfordshire creates their own brand and tries to compete, although that would be, it might work at a local level. You might learn a lot about what you're growing, and you might find that there are local customers who value, but they're probably only going to buy a few tons a year, so it's probably going to be no more than a hobby or a pilot project. But I think that what farms, when I gather farming, when I get in a group get in a room with a group of farmers and ask them to talk about their farms, these days, more often than not, they talk about something that's completely unrelated to where most of their revenue comes from. I bet if you talk to the family that are hosts today, they would talk about Groundswell. And of course, that Groundswell is all about their farming, so it's a bad example. But I remember quite recently in a room, and there were 20 leading British farmers, and they were asked to introduce themselves. And every one of them talked about a rock festival, or they talked about some diversification that one of their children was doing. And we went round the table. There was no requirement that they should do that, but none of them said, I am a large commodity farmer in East Anglia reliant on the government's cheque to keep going. So I think that mindset is already there. And yes, if everybody just adds a little bit of value to their wheat, that's probably not the solution. But it's a journey. And you start to have different conversations, and you might discover that out of that journey there's some technology that you didn't know about before. You might make small scale mills on the farm because you realise that actually there's a sort of shortage of supply. There's all sorts of things that come out of it. But if you're all doing the same thing and you're not thinking and you're just waiting to receive orders from the market, you're never going to break out of this. It is expensive to develop a brand, but I think we tend to think again of certain types of brand. I mean, I've obviously in my other life have been involved in developing quite significant brands, but they've all been developed on a shoestring. Certainly on a shoestring compared with the big brands in the marketplaces. You know, I developed a chocolate brand, Green and Blacks. I mean, we had a fraction of the budget of the big confectionery businesses around the world. So it's possible, you know, with passion and with, you know, ingenuity to do things on a shoestring. And so I'm talking about, you know, even smaller brands, farm scale brands. You really don't need much money. You know, I in my talk that I've just done, I showed the egg boxes that we've developed, which we sell our organic eggs in local Waitroses, and we sell in probably 20 London stores. They were developed with a friend who is quite a well-known designer who likes drawing chickens. It didn't cost me a penny. So, you know, we've done everything on an absolute shoestring. I mean, you know, farmers go out and buy combines. You know, I don't know if you could probably tell me what a combine costs, but they're reluctant to spend money, you know, just a fraction of that cost on very simple marketing, telling their story. They get a much better return on it. And of course, there's no reason why a local brand of apples needs to be more expensive than the everyday brand of supermarket apples. It tends to be because the supermarket sees as an opportunity to charge a premium, because the sort of people who are more interested in local tend to be premium shoppers. I would hesitate to encourage people to charge less for things, because one of my, you know, big messages to farmers is they've undersold their produce. So I think you probably have to go out there. You can't solve every problem in the world. Food poverty is an issue that has been caused by a whole raft of societal issues, and I don't think farmers are to blame for it. So, you know, if there are ways that you can help fix it in your community, other ways by supplying, you know, food banks or community fridges, which is a new initiative which is taking off, then I think that's a really exciting thing to do. But be proud of what you're producing, charge an appropriate price for it. If the supermarkets are willing to let you charge that price, you know, celebrate that. And yes, it may be a little less accessible to certain people, but find other ways of reaching those people in your community if you feel that they're being priced out of that access to that market. And when I've worked with other small producers who are perhaps unfamiliar, I mean, I work with supermarkets in my other life, so I know how it works, but when I work with people who've never actually dealt with a supermarket before, it's amazing how timid they are. They assume that they're going to be beaten up. They assume that their pricing has to relate straight across the board to other products that are there already. And they fail to spot that the reason they're going into them is that the supermarkets see a point of differentiation. The thing that benefits supermarkets more than anything else is somebody who can come in and raise prices. You know, supermarkets don't benefit from dropping prices. It's just they're competing against each other, and so there is this downward pressure. But if you can come in with a slightly different or a radically different product which actually gets prices up, then they're the winners. With Green and Blacks, when I was building a chocolate brand, you know, we went in and said, we're never going to sell at the rate of sale of a Cadbury or whatever. But actually, we know that your margins on Cadbury are actually pretty low, your percentage margins. So with us, we'll give you a decent margin, and you're going to get 4 times the price or 3 times the price. Do the maths. It doesn't matter if we sell at a tenth of the rate initially. You'll still make more cash on a, you know, linear foot of shelf space than you will out of the other things. So it's understanding the economics of the supermarket. When you have that conversation, you know, there is a real opportunity to charge. I mean, there comes a point where if you charge too much, their customers won't buy. But you need to test that. That's the whole point of going into them. Agriculture in the UK in 20 years' time, I think that there will be a lot less land farmed, but I think that the land that is farmed is going to be farmed much smarter. So I think there will be more technology deployed. I think it will be using a lot less chemical intervention, or certainly the sort of chemical intervention that we're used to now. So, but I think we will be using all sorts of technologies to limit the inputs. But we will be regenerating ourselves. We'll have to regenerate ourselves. I mean, they are shot to pieces. And I think a lot more food is going to be produced, as I say, intensively, some of it inside, or in what we might traditionally have called horticulture. But I think on the back of that, agriculture could be a much more vibrant industry.